Mr. Souder.
Thank you. I've got a variation of the same question you were just going through, because one of the problems we have is that it appears that AIG was treated differently than other companies throughout this whole thing, in this sense, that the holders of the debt were paid at par, which means that in effect the banks got 100%, but for example GM creditors, small businesses all across America, and in other companies that were let go, they got 10 cents on the dollar, 30 cents on the dollar, and it's part of a fact, but a perception that that was unfair, that Wall Street was covered but Main Street wasn't in debt. Now, AIG was different in what sense? Now, I know, was it 120 separate finance companies and 80 insurance, or is that flipped, something like that? In other words, it was a collection, it wasn't one.
It was a big, complex collection of companies, correct.
And that if the insurance divisions were separated and came under state, part of the argument is state regulation, that they were so intertwined with the finance. But let me ask one other question before we get into details of that. You said bankruptcy wasn't an option, but it also meant that, did you try to put pressure on the people who held the debt to write down some of their debt, or once you made the statement we weren't going to let it fail, were they just playing hardball and saying we weren't going to write down anything? Why didn't they get the same pressure that GM suppliers had and everybody else to write down their debt?
As I've said, and this isn't me trying to suggest anything was done wrong, I had nothing to do with that. So I was not involved in the negotiation. I was not involved in anything surrounding those payments. But I will explain one thing to you, which is fundamental for you to understand, is the government, we have an antiquated regulatory system and a lack of the necessary authorities. And so if there was a bank, there is a way to wind that down. But this was a non-bank, and there was.
I understand that. Let me.
There's no way to avoid.
Let me ask you. There's no way except the threat of real bankruptcy, and that if you're a bank and think you can negotiate at par and get a full percent and you don't have a threat of bankruptcy, the question is did anybody threaten them? Did anybody say that if we're not going to, I mean, did we in effect yield the debate at the beginning, they played hardball and we had no way to do it, that if in fact you would have even threatened to say, hey, we can cover the insurance people, but the finance side over here, you better negotiate down or that side will go bankrupt, and then you'd wind up probably having to do what we did in TARP anyway, which is put cash reserves into the banking system to try to cover the fact that the bankruptcy went out. Would that not be true? In other words, had they gone bankrupt and there really was a catastrophic threat, which I believe because I voted for TARP, that a catastrophic threat, wouldn't you have just had to put more money in the banking system but not necessarily at par?
As I said, Congressman, I didn't, as I said, I wasn't involved in that. So I can't
You're saying the New York Fed did that.
I can't comment beyond what I've said.
That when you got involved, once TARP was there, the decision was already made that it wasn't going to go bankrupt. Is that correct?
Well, first of all, I was involved in supporting the initial rescue, and then.
So you were involved. Just a second. You were involved, and did you advise the Fed to try to get what they could and not do pay at par?
What the Fed, the initial rescue was not when they dealt with the payment to counterparties. So I supported the Fed on the initial loan, and then later in November, the situation had deteriorated to the point, and values in insurance businesses all around the world had deteriorated to the point that this was a company that would go down without capital. And so now we had capital, and my team and I participated in making that decision, made the decision to put $40 billion of equity into AIG.
The problem that I have is that it appears to me that AIG was treated differently, so much so, even listening to that, it's like, well, we put some money in initially, and then we put more money in because they couldn't fail, where in the other everything from Citibank to Merrill Lynch to everything else, there were processes where there were conditions on money coming in, where there were guidelines on money coming in, and they used the leverage of the threat of bankruptcy to do that. Then in this case, it appears that it was different, and it partly is that the creditors are different. Furthermore, that some of the critical information here was withheld from being public at the request of the New York Fed, that had that been public, people would have seen it. And there was an attempt to even keep it quieter because that was critical, that information, to understand what was going on behind. And it is extremely frustrating to all of us on this committee, and you can hear it in different types of questions, about how this came to be. And I don't think there's been a compelling case made that AIG is unique.
Has expired, but I would say that if Mr.